Well, good evening, everyone. Wonderful to be with you all here tonight. I'll go ahead and invite you to take out your Bibles and turn with me to the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 11, which I imagine for most of you here is probably the most well known chapter of Hebrews for you already, isn't it? It's a chapter that we spend a lot of time talking about. Anytime the subject of faith comes up, this is the automatic chapter that I would imagine comes to mind for most of you here. It's a chapter that's full of amazing characters, people that you read about all over the course of the Bible, starting way back when in Genesis and reaching up to this time period that the author's writing in right here and now. There are stories here within this chapter that we read and talk about as kids growing up in our Bible classes, but it doesn't just stop in kids' classes. No, we think about this and we appreciate this chapter quite a lot the older that we get and the more that we think about these things and what they mean for each one of us. And we can look at these chapter and these characters and realize they did it. They ran their race. They were able, in the midst of a lot of persecution most of the time, to live faithful lives in accordance with the things that they did. They are written now for all of us for all time. And that's pretty amazing. And we should take a lot of encouragement from that fact. But in the midst of this chapter, in which you could spend a lot of time looking in many different directions, I want to spend some time this evening looking at what are my personal favorite verses from this chapter, which happen to be my personal favorite verses from the book of Hebrews and just some of my personal favorite verses from the Bible in general. And it's actually verses that don't include anyone specific. Look with me at verses 13 through 16. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better. That is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. When I was growing up as a younger kid, I would spend a lot of time with my dad in the truck, going to work with him. He's been in the cabinet business for as long as I've been around, and I got to go with him growing up, whether it was weekends or aspects of the summer, going on installs, whatever it might be. I spent a lot of time riding in the truck with him. And my dad was not much of a radio guy. He didn't just listen to random stuff on the radio. He's always been more into audiobooks. And back when I was growing up as a kid, you still had audiobooks on CDs that you listened to. Things have changed a little bit since then, haven't they? And now we have Bluetooth and Audible and things like that, which he now uses. But back then, you had these big square boxes that were full of all these CDs that would encapsulate a single book. And he would listen to fiction books and nonfiction books. And he even had the Bible on audiobook. And sometimes we would listen to the Bible together, and he would ask me sometimes what it was I wanted to listen to from the Bible. And I can remember as a kid thinking, I want to listen to the book of Hebrews. And I'm going to be quite honest, it wasn't because I cared too much about what most of the book of Hebrews said. Like, I was pretty young at the time, and things like sacrifices and the law and all that didn't really make sense to me. I didn't really pay attention. That wasn't my focus. No, I wanted to listen to the book of Hebrews just for these verses right here. And so we would take out that CD and put it in, and sometimes it would be like an hour into the CD, and I wasn't really paying attention to anything that came before it, but my ears kind of perked up whenever Hebrews 11 popped up. And I knew, wait, we're getting close. Like this is the cool chapter. This is all the faithful characters, and then these verses here, which just kind of sent shivers down my spine. As a young kid, I understood that these verses are powerful. They impacted me way back then, and they continue to impact me today, and I imagine they impact a lot of you here as well. And so it's these verses that I want to spend some time talking about. Now, these verses kind of serve as an interlude to this chapter. He goes from talking about specific people to talking about specific people again after these verses. But here in the middle, you have these which kind of talk about the verses previous to it and also the verses after it. These powerful messages that kind of build up within this one passage to this climactic point in verse 16. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And it's that phrase there that I want to think about and kind of springboard our lesson off of this evening. God is not ashamed. Have you ever really thought about that phrase much before? God is not ashamed. I'm going to be honest, I don't really think about it too much. When I think about God and who he is and his experiences and his character and all that, usually shame is not one of the first words that come to mind. No, I might think, well, God is powerful and he is wise and holy. And shame, that doesn't really fit much into the profile of God or of a creator because certainly he's above all of that. Like he's above feelings of shame. He's in control, right? But that's what this verse says. It says, God is not ashamed. That's what this passage builds up to. Now, what I want to do in this lesson, I want to start with this idea of God being ashamed, and then kind of look at that in correlation with the rest of the passage as it builds up to this final idea. So we're kind of starting at the end and then working our way back. So, God and shame. If we're thinking about the word shame, kind of a basic definition of it, you might say is embarrassment. Like that's a synonym for shame. Embarrassment through the harming of your reputation. And all of you can understand this on a personal and practical level, can't you? Like, did you ever go through middle school or high school? Then you probably understand this principle. To me, it's like the stereotypical image that you get in movies of the picked on kid getting tripped in the hallway and all their stuff falls out of their hands and then people are making fun of them and they're embarrassed, and their reputation is harmed. And maybe you went through something sort of like that growing up. And now as you've gotten older, that transitions more into the workforce. And sometimes you make blunders and you make mistakes. And sometimes there are people who kind of look down on you, and your reputation is harmed, and you're embarrassed by something that happens at work. So maybe you can kind of understand those sort of real life situations. And I would imagine that a scenario that impacts a lot of you here, that maybe hits even closer to home than this one, is your children. You ever gotten embarrassed by the behavior of your children before? It's like the horror stories that I've heard of like a husband talking to his wife or a wife talking to her husband in the confines of their home, talking about something that theoretically is supposed to be confidential, like maybe even talking about someone else that goes to church with you or something like that. And then inevitably, once you get into public with them, there your child goes blurting out whatever you said in private. Maybe you've been through something like that and you feel that sense of shame or embarrassment based on what your child said or their behavior. Now, I want you to think about this sort of definition and these sort of examples and then apply it to God. Now, can it be applied? Does God get ashamed? Well, I think kind of based off of this definition, and especially this second example of a child acting up, I would say, yeah, I think God gets ashamed. Aren't we supposed to be his children? Don't we make mistakes? Don't we embarrass God sometimes? Now, one of the key elements that I think of is going back in the time period of the Bible to Exodus, to the time in Egypt when God's children were there in captivity. Remember that? How they're being oppressed by Pharaoh, but God wants to get them out because they're his people. He's trying to lead them to a better land. And there becomes this battle between Pharaoh and God. And ultimately, what this battle centers around is God, Yahweh, versus Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. That's kind of where the 10 plagues come into effect. How God is better than all of these other Egyptian gods and way of doing things. He showed he was in control of nature, he's in control of everything, and he was going to get his people out. Now, in that story, with God going through those actions, sending those plagues, having those interactions with Pharaoh and getting them out, what has God done with his people? Well, he's attached his name to them. He's attached his reputation to these people. He's banking on them to be his children and to act right. And that is certainly exemplified in the covenant that he makes with them. But sometimes that comes back to bite God, doesn't it? Because we have two choices. As God's children, either we can honor God, honor his name and his reputation, or we can bring God to shame. The life that we live, the things that we say, we have the opportunity to bring God down, We have an opportunity to lift God's name and his reputation up. So I think answering this, does God and shame go together? Yes, I think it certainly does. But going back to this passage here in Hebrews chapter 11, it says specifically, God is not ashamed. God is not ashamed. So we've already kind of shown here, he has a chance to get ashamed. We have the power to do that. But why is this said here in this passage? God is not ashamed. Really, when you think about it, that's a remarkable statement. That's a statement that we should have a question about. How can we get God to be able to say that about us? What do we need to do in our lives? What type of lives do we need to live? What attitude should we have in our lives that would lead God to say, hey, I am not ashamed of them? And really, that's where the rest of this passage comes into play. And that's where kind of our main points will follow along with. All building up to this idea God is not ashamed. So let's look at it. What did these people do that led God to think this way about them? So, starting off, going back to verse 13, it says that these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them and embraced them. Let's stop there for now. So, who is he talking about here in this passage? These all died in faith. Well, I think we might say that it's talking about the people mentioned previously in this chapter. There's Abel, there's Enoch, there's Noah and Abraham and Sarah, the people that came in the early time period of Genesis who lived pretty great lives, who did faithful things. So that may be who he's talking about. Now, regarding these people, it says that they didn't receive the promises. Now, let's think about that for a moment. What promises is this passage talking about? Now, I would imagine if you think about these people and then you think about the idea of promises, who's the first person that comes to your mind? Probably Abraham, right? You think about promises and Abraham and how they go hand in hand together. These promises God's given to him, which may be the most famous ones in Scripture. Just briefly look at those with me. Go back to Genesis chapter 12. This is where God first promises these things to Abraham and forms this kind of covenant relationship with him. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All right, three promises that are given here in this passage. First off, hey, Abram, you're going to have a pretty great land. Big, nice, special piece of land. On top of that, you're going to have a whole bunch of descendants. There's going to be a lot of people that comes through your line. And then to top it all off with the best one, there's going to be this special blessing that's going to come through you and your line. It's going to affect everyone else here on the earth. Now, that one, that's a little farther off. But what about these first two here? Now, I want you to realize something very quickly after this, actually within the next chapter or two, Abram's taken into Canaan. He's actually there in that promised land. God says, hey, here it is. Here is your land. And Abram can look around and see miles and miles, and there it is. There's his land. But was it really Abram's land yet? When you think about it, those first two promises kind of have to go together. What good does miles of untapped country do for a solo rider like Abram? Doesn't really do all that much good. No, in order to really inherit and have that special land, you kind of have to have the people attached with it. You have to have people to fill the land, to cultivate it. There are other nations camping up in the land right now. You're going to have people to come in and drive them out. So even though Abram can see his land right there, he hadn't fully inherited the full picture of it. So maybe that's what it's referring to in Hebrews chapter 11, how they didn't receive the promises. So maybe that can make sense for someone like Abraham. But what about everyone else? You realize they didn't receive these promises. They came before Abram. Abel, Enoch, Noah, they didn't get those specific promises of a land, a nation, and this special blessing. No, they came before it. So what about them? Well, it seems to me that this is a clue pointing to something better to come that impacts not just these people, but all of us here today. There are promises that God's given us of something better to come, and we're going to fully develop this throughout this lesson. But I think that's what it's talking about, not just specifically Abram, but everyone who lives a faithful life are granted these promises of God. And regarding that, it says they saw them afar off. What these people did is that they put on spiritual glasses to see with a spiritual vision. And when I think about spiritual vision in the Bible, I think about it in three different ways. You have darkness, being darkened in your understanding, blind to the world around you. You have being awake and seeing things, but the image kind of being blurry, just seeing it from afar. And then you have the full image, 2020 vision, you could say. Now, there were a lot of people, and there are a lot of people today who are blinded, who are darkened in their understanding, who are not seeing with light, spiritual blinders on. People like Cain. He wasn't seeing with light in his heart and in his eyes regarding his brother and the world around him. Same with the people of Noah's day. They weren't thinking that way, they were spiritually blind. But these people here had put on a special type of glasses to see something that wasn't immediately seen by everyone else all around them. But the difficult thing was they didn't fully see that image yet. It says they saw it from afar. And the idea, you can't really see something clear if it's very far away, right? That's the same thing with them. They saw this image, but it was blurry. It kind of reminds me of the language of 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Even though this image may have been blurry, that's kind of where faith comes in, right? It says that they were assured of them. They embraced them. They knew who God was. They knew the promises that God had set before them, and that's what drove their lives. They welcomed them with wide open arms. It's like the videos that you sometimes see of when military people come home in the airport, and you have their loved ones waiting there with arms open wide, ready to embrace them because there's peace and there's comfort there. And that's the same thing with God's promises that He's trying to grant all of us. God's given us that. Now, the question is, have you embraced those promises? Have you welcomed them, or have you kind of shrugged them off because you're not really looking with that type of vision? Well, the example we're given here of these people is put on your spiritual glasses, embrace the promises that God is trying to give you. So that's kind of the first point we'll make here. Secondly, they didn't just embrace these promises. This wasn't just some sort of internal attitude of the mind. No, this was something that went beyond the internals. It says that they confessed something. They confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. I mean, the idea that I get, something that's spoken aloud, maybe to anyone who would listen. You think about Noah, the fact that he preached to the people of his day, hey, wake up. You know what's going to happen? You know what could happen? And you know what you're missing out on? Wake up. They had a testimony. They had a hope. And it says that they declared it plainly. Verse 14. So, do you confess the promises like they did? In your life, in the things that you say, do you make it clear what type of journey you are on? These type of people, their lives were not about towing the middle ground. It wasn't about beating around the bush, about taking a politically correct stance of straddling the fence. No, they didn't care about anything like that. These people stood out. And they were fine with that because they knew the type of journey that they were on and what they were working for in the end. And ultimately, what they were confessing centered around this idea of being strangers and pilgrims. And maybe your version will say exiles. And you think about these people here, you think about someone like Abraham, he was kind of all over the place, wasn't he? Yeah, he lived a pretty nomadic life. Coming from Ur of the Chaldees, he finds himself over there in Egypt at a point. He finds himself in Canaan. He's traveling all over the place, never really had this one settled homeland. Now, These people would have looked up to Abraham, right? Because remember, who is this book of Hebrews being written to? Well, largely Jewish Christians. Think about the messages of the book, something that we've been discussing for pretty much the past month here. Hey, there's something that's better than the old way of doing things, the old law, the sacrifices, all of that. Jesus is better. The new covenant is better, right? That's something that these people needed to hear. But let me add another layer of depth to this passage right here. What was going to happen right after this book was written? Does anyone know when this book was written? Presumably around 68 or so AD. You know what was happening in history at the time? You know what was going to continue to happen and ramp up in the years afterwards? Jerusalem is about to come crumbling down, isn't it? Abraham lived a nomadic life. You look up to him, guess what? You're about to have to do the same thing. What's been foretold and warned for a long time, even back in the time period of Jesus, is hey, when you see all these things happening, when you see the sign of the times, get out. And it's that time. And I think this is kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to that very fact. People who are going to struggle with this. People who looked at a place like Jerusalem like it was their home. This is our religious center. This is where we've grown up. This is all that we know. We need to leave? Yeah, you need to leave. You see the persecution that's ravaging the church? You know what's about to happen? Yeah. They needed this message of comfort to give them confidence that, hey, someone like Abraham did it, a guy who you've looked up to your entire lives. He lived a nomadic life. Don't be afraid to live the same type of life. Don't be afraid to move on because you know that your life goes far beyond some sort of physical city. No, you're looking for a city to come. You're looking for a heavenly country. That's the journey that you are on. You are in exile. You are a pilgrim. So that may have been a message for them, but what about all of us here right now tonight? Do you often think about your life like a pilgrim? Probably not. We don't really live nomadic lives, do we? If any of us here lived a nomadic life, it would probably be because we chose to, not because we were being forced to. No, normally we live pretty comfortable lives. We live static lives where we put down roots and we're comfortable and we don't really move on. And, in a sense, that can be fine. But I think it's people like us who sometimes need to hear this message more than anyone that we are on a spiritual journey as spiritual pilgrims, and this world is not our home. We have opportunity to go back to the world. Says verse 15, surely if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. God's people in the time period of Exodus, what we remember about them is they spent time complaining and thinking about going back to Egypt, going back to their past way of life. Guess what? All these people listed here in this chapter could have done the same thing, and all of us here can go back to the way that we were in the past. We can go back to the way of the world. This calls us to something beyond that. Don't be static. No, look forward. Don't look back. You think Abraham was spending his life thinking about Ur? No, he was looking for something beyond that. That was the difference between Lot and Lot's wife. She looked back. That was the difference. You look back. And we're pilgrims. That's why we kind of sing the songs that we do. This world is not my home. That'll be the invitation song. Here we are, but straying pilgrims, what we sang right before this lesson. Thinking about those lyrics real quick, I want to reread them. Here we are, but straying pilgrims. Here our path is often dim, but to cheer us on our journey, still we sing this wayside hymn. Here our feet are often weary on the hills that throng our way. Here the tempest darkly gathers, but our hearts within us say. Here our souls are often fearful of the pilgrim's lurking foe, but the Lord is our defender, and he tells us we may know that yonder over the rolling river, where the shining mansions rise, soon will be our home forever. And the smile of the blessed giver gladdens all our longing eyes. This song was taken from this passage. And that's how we have to look at ourselves, that we are pilgrims confessing our journey that we're on. And ultimately, that kind of leads to the final culminating verse, the culminating idea of this passage. Not only did these people embrace an internal standpoint of these promises, not only did they confess them, but it adds on to it, verse 16. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. They let desire fill their hearts and completely drive their lives. And that's a wonderful example. It was a wonderful example to this audience, and maybe for them it was, hey, desire something beyond Jerusalem. But where is your life currently with this principle? Are you desiring something better to come? Going back to what I was kind of talking about earlier, this can be a difficult thing for us because of the lives that we live. Because we have things pretty easy most of the time. I think that can sometimes be a trap. Comfort and ease. Sometimes we just want to dig in and live lukewarm lives, not really try to move forward. And listen, brethren, we can never be half hearted with our desire. No, the idea that I get here from this passage is, hey, you need to stretch out with everything that you possibly have, not just some half hearted effort. No, it's like the outfielder doing a Superman dive for the ball. Every fiber of his being going out to just snag that ball with the tip of his glove. That's how much he wanted it. Now, how much do you want heaven? You have to want it with all of your being. You have to go for it and stretch out and reach it. And ultimately, you know why you should want to do that? Because of what's waiting for you at the end. Or I guess I should say who is waiting for you at the end. Hebrews chapter 12, well-known first couple verses. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, have all these people here cheering us on as we go on our journey. Well, then let us lay aside every weight, the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Hey, remember who's waiting for you at the end of the finish line. Remember that and stretch out to reach it. Don't let heaven slip away. Don't let it go past your fingertips. Don't let it be like the wind running through your fingers. No, this is important. This is what drove their lives. This is the desire that filled their hearts completely and impacted who they were. And ultimately, that leads us to where we started. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You know why God was not ashamed of these people? It's because these people embraced the promises that they were given. These people confessed the journey that they were on, and these people desired with all of their heart to be in this heavenly country. And it's these type of people that God is preparing a city for. Those are the people that he wants there. Those are the people who he is not ashamed of. Now, does that define you? Are you someone who is lifting up the name of God and his reputation? Can God look at you boldly and proudly and say, I am not ashamed? Because guess what? God has put his name on the line by offering you the promises that he has. You realize that? God has put his name and his reputation at stake for you to become a Christian. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? Now, what are you going to do with it? Don't throw those promises in his face. He wants you to be in a heavenly country with him for all eternity. And if God, the creator of everything, has specifically created and has a heavenly country there waiting for us, yeah, I want to be there. And I hope all of you do too. If there's anything that we might be able to do for you this evening to help you along that way, help you draw closer to that goal, draw you closer to the God of heaven and all eternity, I hope you will let us know. We're here, family here. We want to help each other out. and draw closer together into God. So if we can do that for you, you can let it be known as we stand, as we sing this invitation song.